Hello, everyone. Welcome to week number 4, the first lecture of week number 4, I guess week 4A, and then we'll do week 4B. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about high and low culture, or, well, we'll be phrasing it in a number of different ways. We'll be talking about popular culture and high art, and this notion of high art, which we don't actually, it occurs to me suddenly, we don't hear this expression all that often anymore. I have two texts on, two articles on Blackboard for you to have a look at. One of them is more important than the other, but if I'm being perfectly honest with you for this week, both of them, it would be perfectly conceivable for you to just quickly skim them or just focus on the lectures. And there's a reason for that. The reason is because I'm going to be pulling from other sources as well, and I'm not entirely convinced that the articles give a full and comprehensive account of the work of the people that I'm going to be talking about today. So what I have online is an article that appeared in a like a newspaper by Raymond Williams titled High and Popular Culture. This is really at the center of today's discussion. And a chapter from a very popular book titled Culture and Anarchy by Matthew Arnold. And it may seem as though these two people are at odds with one another in the sense that you'll see one of them is defending a notion of, or lamenting the loss of a notion of high culture, and the other is trying to redefine high culture and to make it less highbrow, we might say. But the two of them I would nonetheless group into a shared orientation, and that orientation is what I call the British orientation. So we'll be talking mostly today about the British school, or the British orientation within within media and within culture, and hopefully we'll begin to compare and contrast the British orientation with alongside the Toronto orientation or school and the Slovenian. So we have three different orientations where there is admittedly some overlap there, but I think it's much more interesting to show how they're asking slightly different questions, focusing in slightly different ways, and they have slightly different presuppositions and so on. So, you know, I want to begin by framing the material that we've looked at so far. We began with a really simple introduction to media, culture, and masses from within the perspective of modernity or modern studies. So we looked closely at the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, of Emma Goldman, and George Simmel. And I opened up at this time some various orientations for you. We discussed the Toronto School with Marshall McLuhan as our exemplary figure within the Toronto School, and the Slovenian School with Slavoj Žižek as the exemplary figure within the Slovenian School. Today, I'm adding this third orientation. And I'll put this one in a different color so that we know that this is where we're focusing today. The British school. Now, if we're making a chart, and we can keep developing this chart, perhaps, if we follow on this trajectory that we've been following on for quite a few modules now, then we'll see that this chart will keep expanding and become more and more interesting. So if I add a row here, right here, this row would be called the exemplary figure, right? The central sort of figure that we've been focusing on. So it would be Marshall McLuhan here, Slovenian school, it would be Slavoj Žižek here, and the British school, it will be, we could say, Raymond Williams. However, I'm more inclined to talk about a person, and hopefully by the end of today, you'll see why. I didn't include a reading from this person for this week because I didn't want to include too many readings. but Stuart Hall. And I think I'm much more inclined to place Stuart Hall at the center, but nonetheless, we're going to, still talk about some of these other figures like Raymond Williams and so on. So we have these exemplary figures. What I'm doing, though, is I'm sort of putting to the side the material from the first week on modernity. And so some of you might be asking, well, we're focusing on these schools. Why are we not talking more about what we were discussing in the first class, namely these thinkers of modernity? The reason is because the first group of thinkers are not necessarily within a shared orientation. When we talk about the Toronto School, we can name some people here that are sharing particular questions, presuppositions, ways of studying culture and the media. And that includes people like Marshall McLuhan, Harold Innis, and so on. We can say the same of the Slovenian school, Slavoj Žižek, Alenka Supancic, Mladen Doler. We can say the same of the British school, as we'll see today, Raymond Williams, Matthew Arnold, Stuart Hall, and many others. But we can't say that about the first group of thinkers, because first off, they were from different locations. Emma Goldman spent a lot of time in the United States, for example, although she was kicked out of the United States, spent a lot of time in Russia. George Simmel, German, and so on and so on. But the difference is when we're talking about schools, we're talking about particular orientations within a context. When we're talking about George Simmel, Friedrich Nietzsche, Emma Goldman, yes, they existed within a context, but more what's interesting about them is they're helping us to define a context. And this is how I would put it. So we could, for the time being, for example, define like context one, and we could imagine that there will be another context or historical moment, if you like. I don't really like saying historical moment, and then we can think about it as in like there's more than one. Okay, this might seem really abstract to you at this point, but think about it like this. If the first thinkers were helping us understand the modern context, which is context one, then these schools that we're looking at now are situated somewhere at the beginning of a more contemporary context, for lack of a better term, a different context. Things are, the environment has shifted, the media has changed. And I think that's quite significant. And so we should try and mark those changes. So it's true that the Toronto, the Slovenian, and the British schools all operated within a context, within an environment, within an ideological framework, if you like. And it's true also that this is an environment or a context or ideology that has shifted since the modern period. We're not in the same period that were the same context or environment or whatever that we were in when Friedrich Nietzsche was writing, or when Emma Goldman was writing and speaking, or when George Simmel was writing, and so on. Some things have changed. We could at least admit that some things have changed. Some of us might be more inclined to claim that things have changed quite considerably, and it's not just that some things have changed. There's been something of a fundamental shift. We can describe that in any number of ways, depending upon your school or orientation. Some people would call it postmodernity. Some people would call it neoliberalism. Some people would call it advanced capitalism. There's all kinds of different names. Some people would call it the post-literate electronic age, more in the words or the vernacular of the Toronto School, for example. But something has changed. I'm going to come back to this in another class, I hope. But for now, we can just say that the Toronto, Slovenian, and British schools, each in their own way, are responding and implicated in this transition from the modern context, context one, into the contemporary context, from the modern environment or ideology into the contemporary environment or ideology. This is fundamental. We cannot, for example, simply claim that Marshall McLuhan was modern, because although he was interested in such modern topics as the growth of crowds, urbanization, and so on, he was nonetheless already talking about a key shift that occurred in society as a result of that. It's a subtle distinction. I imagine that many of you are not going to quite pick up on what this subtle distinction is, and perhaps that's okay. but try and understand. Modernity is the movement of people. It's the growth of new sensations, according to Marshall McLuhan and so on. The contemporary period is, in some sense, an extension of the modern context. It's a consequence of that movement. It's a fundamentally new orientation and context as a consequence of these forces that were being discussed in the modern context, right? Modernity was defined by a certain set of characteristics. It involved the movement toward secularization, the death of God, the apparent concern of the individual vis-a-vis the crowd or the masses, the critique of the expansion of quantitative logic, of positivism, increasing bureaucratization, which is why some of you might remember from prior sociology courses the work of Max Weber when he was discussing bureaucracy and the disenchantment of the world. These are very modern questions and concerns. You're witnessing changes in the modern period, and you're asking about these changes. What are they? In the contemporary context, we might say, and again, this is the subtle distinction, we're living in a context which responds to that, which is a consequence of all of those changes, and not merely an awareness that things are changing, you see. So the Toronto, Slovenian, and British schools are responding in one way or another, and indeed in each their own way, to what comes after modernity, to the new contemporary world. And my goal is to try and show you what I mean by that, but very slowly, and perhaps I won't fully answer it today. So let's begin then by focusing on the British school in its own terms, and then using that as a point of departure for comparing and contrasting the British school to the Toronto and Slovenian school, which I think would be a really productive analytic exercise, because these really abstract notions become clearer when you have something to contrast them with, I think, and I find that's very helpful for students. So let's look at Raymond Williams. Okay, so I've spelled Raymond Williams' name here so that you can see how to spell it. It's not plural, it ends in an S. And I posted a short piece that was in the newspaper, magazine, periodical, The New Republic, published in 1974, titled High and Popular Culture. Already, I hope you can see what's at stake in the article. It's right there in the title. It's talking about high culture and popular culture. Okay, so some of us are asking, well, what's the difference? Are these the same? What are these? Because they are concepts for Williams. And one of the things I would admit up front that I don't quite like about Raymond Williams, which in other cases I actually tend to prefer in thinkers, which is strange for me, but it's the lack of analytic precision when discussing these concepts. It's not clear exactly what these concepts fully mean from the article, but we can get a sense and we'll move toward a sort of definition of what he means by these. It's also a topic that is discussed by Matthew Arnold in the chapter that I published in Culture and Anarchy, this notion of high and popular culture. But he takes what seems to be a different approach. And indeed, it does seem to be a different approach if you're focusing only at the level of the content of the argument. For Williams, in any case, he begins by posing the following question. What, and I'm quoting him, what is the relationship of high culture to popular culture? What is the relationship of high culture to popular culture? Well, the first thing that Williams does, and I didn't expect this, I didn't plan for this, was that he actually quotes, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but he's quoting Matthew Arnold's definition from Culture and Anarchy of high culture. I'm quoting Matthew Arnold, and therefore quoting Raymond Williams quoting Matthew Arnold, it's meta. High culture is the best that has been thought and written. The best that has been thought and written. Okay, some of you are saying, is this a normative judgment? What do you mean by the best? And who gets to decide what is the best? And indeed, that's a part of the question. It's nonetheless, I think, a rather admirable definition of high culture. It seems like something that would be worth preserving to some extent. We don't want to critique necessarily and completely empty out the notion of high culture, because at least according to both Matthew Arnold and Raymond Williams, there's something about high culture that really does express the way of life and the sensibilities of a social group. And we don't want to do away with that necessarily. Some people might want to, but this is the position of our authors. The claim, though, is the claim that's often made, and this is not the claim being made by Raymond Williams, but rather the claim against which Raymond Williams is writing. The claim is often that we're losing high culture. We're losing high cultural artifacts, a sense of the best of what's done in the world of art, culture, sculpture, so on. We're losing it, and we're losing it because of what? Well, he doesn't say this, but it's quite clear. It's because of modernity. In other words, because of democracy, because of the democratization of education suddenly, not just the privileged to get educated, but it is more possible for more people to become educated. So we're in danger of losing high culture, according to some, precisely because of the growth of democratic access to education. We'll just say access to education. This is part of the reason. More importantly, it's because of the growth of, I'm going to write this actually. So some of the reasons that are often given for why we're losing high culture is because of democratic education. It's because of the growth of popular communication systems. In other words, technology and media, and the movement, or let's say transition into a mass society. In other words, the density and hyper interactivity of groups. Well, these are quite modern things. If you go back to our first class where we were discussing what's happening during the period of modernity, I don't think it's a stretch to see a lot of this as what we've been talking about. You can see why then media, since that's number 2, is so important. You can see why masses are so important in the period of modernity, and democratic education is merely a consequence of that, but it's also a consequence of secularization and so on. The desire to know for yourself and not simply to be told what to believe and so on. I should also mention that you can see the way in which questions of technological advancement, particularly media technologies, but remember, for Marshall McLuhan, media is everything in a sense, so it includes all technological advances, was the central question in the Toronto School, particularly in the work of Marshall McLuhan, where he argued that basically the dominant media of the time as environment leads us into a global village of tribal interconnectivity, that is the internet. So Raymond Williams claims that this is one argument that we hear about high culture today. We could call it, if you like, the argument from nostalgia, an argument that laments the loss of high culture. You know, we're losing high culture. This is what people are thinking. We're losing high culture. Why are we losing it? How can we preserve it? How can we regain high culture? On the other hand, there's an argument that, so that's one side. On the other hand, there's an argument that high culture is always associated with class divisions within a capitalist society, such that high culture in some ways constituted a class division, and that high culture has morphed into popular culture. Well, Raymond Williams is actually against these two ways of framing the debate about high culture and popular culture. He claims that we're fundamentally confusing the terms. He's not against the idea of there being a class division. He's quite, I mean, he is a Marxist, right? And so he's interested in class divisions, as you'll see what I mean by that soon enough. But what he does at the very beginning of his article is he signals a bigger project that he's done elsewhere, where he's defining the concept of culture. Like, what does culture mean? And the way he does it is what a more contemporary French philosopher named Foucault, Michel Foucault, what he called genealogy. In other words, you take an idea and you see how it's morphed and changed throughout history to show that our contemporary notions about culture are situated within a particular historical episteme or a particular historical knowledge, and that in previous historical times, in previous historical moments, we had a different understanding. So he finds that a very long time ago, so we're talking about Raymond Williams here still, a very long time ago, we'll call this period 1, culture was defined as culture of. It was always culture of something. So it had something to do with cultivation, which means that, you know, if you think of cultivation, you think of people having a particular skill to cultivate something. So it had to do with a particular skill or quality on the part of a person or people. So this means that it was associated with a particular skill or quality. In other words, it was not a general concept. It was used much more restrictively. So I'll come back to what I mean by that in just a moment. In the late 18th and early 19th century, culture wasn't used quite as restrictively, but much more generally. So culture came to be used as kind of like synonymous with kind of like synonyms for civilization or society. So it was more universal, you know? If in time 1, culture as, it was like particular people or groups of people, particular is the key word here, particular groups of people had a culture of something. The ability to fabricate something, to cultivate something, a particular skill. There was a culture of doing something. In the late 18th, early 19th century, it was universal, more universal. Everybody was within culture. It wasn't just particular people who had a culture of. It was much more synonymous with being a social being. So if in the first period it was a particular and restrictive concept or definition used to describe some people, then in the second period, in the 18th or 19th century, it was used more universally to describe people as such. This means that it was universal to describe all social groups, but all sorts of, all people as being within a sort of universal social group. Finally, in the third period, we'll call this the later period, so after the 19th century, it became, how shall I put it? We have cultures. You see, in the first period, you see the word culture, right? It's a singular in the singular. In the second period, you still have a singular culture. And the third period, you have cultures, plural. So we have a restrictive, particular definition. Then we have a universal, general definition, which leads finally to a plural definition, which means that we have cultures instead of culture. So we retain what was there in the second period because we're still talking about everybody is in a culture. Everybody is in a culture, not everybody is in the culture. It's particular. It still has a sense of particularity and it still has a sense of universality. You know, like everybody's in a culture, but everybody's in a particular culture. Okay, I'm going to repeat this one more time because it's a really subtle distinction. At the beginning, you have a particular group that can be defined as a culture, which means that many people are not a culture or not in culture or not cultured in this sense. So it's particular groups based on quality or skills. It's a really restrictive definition. And there's many people who don't get to say that they are a part of culture. In the 18th, 19th century, everybody's in culture, but there's no particular cultures. Everybody is in society. It's used very in a bland sort of way. Finally, in the more contemporary period, we talk about cultures in the plural, in the sense that it's universal, yes, but it's also particular. It's universal precisely because everybody is in a culture. Here we might put it like this: everybody is in culture. I hope you can see the difference here. Again, it is subtle, but I think it at this point, I think I've made it quite obvious. So what's the point? In the third period, you have different cultures. Just like you had in the first period to some extent, but everybody's in a particular culture. So there's different cultures, which are the sensibilities, manners, ways of living of specific groups. So period one, I feel like I should repeat it quite a bit here just to make sure everybody understands. Period one, a particular group was a culture based on its skill or quality. There could be many people who are not in a culture. Period two, 18th, 19th century, culture is universal. It included everybody. It was synonymous with society and civilization. So there's no such thing as non-culture here. In the first period, there is such a thing as a sort of non-cultured group of people. In the third period, it's like a combination of period one and two. In that culture is universal, as it is in the second period, except everybody can have a culture, like in period one. There are specific cultures. So ultimately in period three, what we're finally seeing as a definition of culture is culture is a whole way of life of a group of people. A whole way of life of a group of people. This is also Raymond Williams' definition of culture, or part of his definition of culture, and that he finds quite acceptable. Okay, well, many of you who have taken an anthropology course probably recognize that anthropology often has as one of its key presuppositions precisely this definition of cultures. You know, and I'm putting this really naively, so forgive me for not being as precise as one often is in anthropology, but there tends to be this sort of notion that there are different cultures and they're different whole ways of life of different groups of people. And some people would claim that this lapses into a certain type of relativism in the sense that you can't rank one culture above another culture. And there's all these sorts of debates, right? Okay, so culture now, I'm going to clear this. So culture now is often thought of as a shorthand for the practices and products of a whole way of life for a group of people. So it's the practices, it's when we say the whole way of life of a group of people, we mean the way they practice or behave or interact with one another. But we also mean, and I say we as in followers of the work of Raymond Williams, which doesn't necessarily include me, in fact. But we're also talking about the products, the things that are manufactured. Look, I made this a few years ago to demonstrate a very difficult and abstract concept to students. It's what's called a Klein bottle, which has a hole here, and it comes inside and then back outside to get back inside, and it goes outside to go further inside. It's a very unique thing. Some people think black holes are made this way. Some people think this is the way ideology functions and the unconscious and so on. I quite like it, but the only reason I'm showing it to you is because I made it. I designed it and I printed it with a 3D printer. So it's a cultural product, we might say. And particularly a cultural product within the psychoanalytic community. But, you know, this is, some might say, a work of art. I don't think you would agree with that. I'm not sure I agree with it myself, to be honest. But you can think of all kinds of things. This is culture and a phone, because it's a product of work, of activity, of interactions, of practices, work ultimately being a practice. So we include both the behaviors, interactions, and practices of a group of people, and the products that are developed within that group of people. It can also imply the intellectual work, we should say. So it doesn't have to be obviously material or tangible, something you can point at. It can include intellectual work as well. But when we have this definition, according to Raymond Williams, then it becomes a matter of making our concepts of high culture and popular culture agreeable with this definition of culture. And finally, therefore, it leads us to Raymond Williams' definition of high culture. For Raymond Williams, high culture is used to describe, I'm quoting him, the great body of cultural skills and the great works which embody and represent them. So we kind of have an implicit definition of what is the best. The best means it has something to do with cultural skills, which means the ability to practice within one's culture and to give expression to what's going on within one's culture. So when you're not doing that, it might not be a great work of high culture. It's a very organic definition of high culture when you really think about it. And spontaneously, as I'm talking right now, I find myself I find that I agree with it a little bit more than I originally thought I did. So, you know, if you're, let's put it really simply and naively again, if you're some sort of person who's perceived as a snob and you're totally out of touch with your cultural group, then it might not be high culture, although it might appear to be highbrow. I'm going to give you an example of what I think here, and it's my own personal example. Maybe it's not the best, but I learned that in a lot of rural Canada, landscapes in painting, landscapes tend to be one of the dominant forms of cultural expression in painting. There's a particular reason for that. All kinds of people have explored it, including Margaret Atwood. But there is always an aversion, or very often an aversion to abstraction. We could say intellectually, sure, like an aversion to theory, but I'm talking at the level of painting, there's an aversion to abstract painting. So if you grew up in St. John, New Brunswick, or like I did in Miramichi, and suddenly you do this abstract expressionist painting in the tradition of, say, the New York painters, you might be perceived as being out of touch with the cultural sensibilities of your group. So it seems to me that if we take Raymond Williams' definition of high culture, it would preclude that work of art that I just described as being high culture. It might think itself to be, but it's not. Okay, next, Raymond Williams claims that high culture is tied to real material practices and skills. In other words, the real life of a cultural group. I take issue with this word real, but let's just roll with what Raymond Williams is saying. So nonetheless, Raymond Williams wants to retain a notion of a class divide, because it's true that when you produce a cultural product, it can be taken from you and it can be sold on the market. And Raymond Williams is very suspicious of this, of course. You can imagine, and Williams often critiqued the museum, but the art museum as a place where you go and all of a sudden it's like you enter the doors and these walls delimit and define a zone of culture, of appreciated culture. Raymond Williams says that's basically stupid. I used to sit at a cafe. The first time I read Raymond Williams was when I was a PhD student, so very late. I was sitting at a cafe in Peterborough, New Brunswick, Nada's Cafe, and there was like art all over the walls, kind of like the art you see on my walls here. And, it was framed and so on. And people would come into the cafe and they would go and they would look at the art. I'd be sitting drinking my coffee and they would like be leaning over my table, looking over my shoulder at the art on the wall behind me. They always put their hands behind their back like this, like they're bobbing for apples or something. I act like I'm not doing that myself. And they kind of swarm around the art piece, the painting, like seagulls in a McDonald's parking lot after you throw a French fry. And it's like, this is the art, and we want to be seen decoding the art, right? But what nobody cared to notice was that when they walk into the cafe, on the wall to the left, there's like a bulletin board where people are putting up, there was a little poem that was ripped on a sheet of paper, put up there. There's advertisements for this and that. There's people advertising their own practices, like, I don't know, homeopathy or something like that. And people walk right past it and they're not looking at it with the same intensity and interest and curiosity as they would these paintings on the wall. And Raymond Williams takes issue with that because he says that is culture too. A tractor in a field is culture, and we should examine it with the same curiosity, intensity, and perhaps even ideological critique as you would a painting by Courbet or Malevich or whoever, Salvador Dali, whoever you might think of in the world of art. So he says culture is everything then. It's all this stuff, and this stuff's art too, in a sense. So this means that in some sense, the distinction between high culture and popular culture is not that clear, because high culture can also be popular culture. So we have to return then to our definition of culture for Raymond Williams. It's a whole way of life of a group of people. It involves practices and products, but also when we talk about the best, it's we're talking about the process of let's call it process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development within a culture. So we're focusing on all of these three things when we're talking about culture, and particularly when we need to define high culture or popular culture, we must always think with this notion of culture in mind, according to Raymond Williams. The problem is that a notion of high culture, the exclusive notion of high culture that we tend to have, you know, if the moment you say high culture, there's this sort of naive, quick response as to what you believe high culture to be. You immediately think abstract art or something like that, or, you know, like Beethoven or something like that. You never think the tractor in the field, or, you know, like this lovely home I'm living in. It was built by a single guy, and it's documented, and they created a website where it shows him building it. He had only a few people helping him. It shows him developing contraptions to lift the giant pillars. There's big pillars all around the home here. He crafted it himself, and there's frescoes, and he laid the stone on the floor in the because he's Italian, in the Italian style, creating like a diagram. That's culture. So the problem for Williams ultimately, and this is very important, is that the prevailing notion of high culture is basically undemocratic, and it does not include the cultural sensibilities, the whole way of life of a group, which inevitably should include the working class. Raymond Williams is trying to defend the working class. He's a Marxist, and he's trying to defend the proletariat and the aesthetic of the proletariat and the culture of the working class. High art seems to be bourgeois art for Raymond Williams. Bourgeois means ideological art of the ruling classes, and it doesn't seem to take into account the culture of working people for Raymond Williams. And so for Raymond Williams, the universities and the media, they carry a bias. And the bias is that they don't favor the working class and the cultures of the working class. They transmit, quite naively, a matter-of-fact understanding of high art as something that is beyond the working class. So the problem then is that many people think that popular culture, which for Raymond Williams is almost synonymous with the working class, is somehow corrupting high art. And it could seem as though this is what Matthew Arnold is suggesting. I would disagree with this characterization, but this is what Williams believes. Williams is responding to this. He wants to say it's not corrupting high culture. High culture is divorced from the whole lived reality of the culture within which it is expressed. Okay. So I just use that as a sort of way to gain entry into what I've been calling the British school. If the Toronto School of Media was in Toronto, and if the Slovenian school was mostly in Ljubljana, which I can't spell off the top of my head, Something like that. I think I definitely spelled it wrong, but it's something like that. Ljubljana, Slovenia. The British school is also often called the Birmingham School. It was in Birmingham. The Birmingham School, often referred to also as the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. It relates to a particular center at Birmingham University, which was there from the early 1960s until just after the 2000s, I think 2002. It was called the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. We just used the shorthand Birmingham School. And the Birmingham School was particularly Marxist, particularly focused on the working class, and really trying to attack I would say what it perceived to be bourgeois elements in culture. I don't know how else to put it. So ultimately what they were interested in is attacking and expanding the notion of high culture to take this, to incorporate this let's say, more encompassing notion of culture, which is working class culture, namely the whole ways of life, including the practices and beliefs, the intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic developments of a group of people. Okay, so we know here that we have different thinkers. Marshall McLuhan in the Toronto School, the Birmingham School, we say Raymond Williams, but I'm also want to talk about Stuart Hall. And here we have Slavoj Žižek. Stuart Hall, I think, gives us a better glimpse in terms of what's going on in the British school vis-a-vis the Toronto and Slovenian school. I want to tell you, I mean, I'm not going to waste your time by giving you biographies of these people, because you can find these biographies anywhere on the internet. But what you can't find is these sorts of ways of dealing with the ideas. This is what doesn't exist out there on the internet, and why it's not so easy in one of my classes to just study on the internet. You have to actually engage with the lectures, because we're actually dealing creatively with the material and not simply repeating what's published out there. So Stuart Hall offered an approach to understanding culture that was quite groundbreaking, that had to do with what he called encoding and decoding. Encoding and decoding media, let's just leave it at that. Encoding and decoding the media or culture, cultural objects, whereby media is understood quite broadly. An encoding and decoding approach is also referred to as a semiotic approach. A semiotic approach that has its roots in a lot of other thinkers who we will talk about, one of whom we're going to talk about in the next class. I believe it's on the syllabus that we will, namely Ferdinand de Saussure and Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes on the agenda for next week, so I imagine I'm going to open this up a lot more. This is just our, let's say, gateway drug. Well, what's going on in the encoding and decoding approach to understanding culture? Well, you can see the emphasis is on meaning. You're encoding and decoding the meanings of cultural objects. We're focusing ultimately, though, on what some people call a two-body approach to understanding communication. So this is how I'm going to draw it. Oh God, this is a person. It's a silhouette of a person. And this is another person. I just can't draw very well. So you imagine, they have a mouth, an eye, only one in my drawing. Okay. Two-bodied means you presuppose that there's two people. There's a person who's speaking into the ear of the other person, and this person hears and responds. Sorry, my mouse is chunk. Okay, so you can see that there's like a reciprocity of exchange. One person speaks, one person listens. This is ultimately what Ferdinand de Saussure is trying to develop in his work, but it gets much more nuanced. I mean, first off, when I say this, you're thinking, well, obviously, I know, but it's actually not that obvious. And, you know, in my own work, I critique this. I don't think we have a two-bodied form of communication today. I think we have a one-bodied form of communication where the other person is a prop. Basically, we're basically talking to ourselves, but maybe we'll get to why I say that in another class. So we have this two-bodied approach, and this is in Saussure, and this is in Stuart Hall's work. What's going on with Stuart Hall is he says basically there's a person who is encoding a message, and there's a person who's decoding the message. And then it goes the opposite, right? This person is encoding, and then this person's decoding. So there's an encoding process and a decoding process, which means that in the middle here, there is a message. So there's a message that's encoded for the ears of another person. That person decodes that message and then encodes another message to go right back to the first person, and that person decodes it, and it goes round and round in this particular way. Why is it important to discuss it as encoding and decoding of a message, right? So if I were to just draw this a little bit differently, just so that we could see it more clearly, we have encoding, we have the message, we have decoding. And then it goes back. And around and around and around. So it looks something like that. Why? Well, the point is, we have a sort of naive understanding, according to Stuart Hall, of how messages are transmitted in the media. We think that a message is innocent and it's obvious and its meaning is obvious. But when you adopt an encoding and a decoding perspective, you can realize that the way that a message is decoded might not at all be related to the way in which it was encoded. In other words, it may not be related to the intentions that were there when the message was encoded. I could say something and I could intend it to mean a particular thing, and you can hear it entirely different, and it'll mean something entirely different to you. We know this intuitively when we talk about trigger words, for example. Sometimes we don't know what word could trigger another person, for example. Oftentimes we do, but sometimes we don't. There are people who have had horrific traumas where a word that may seem innocent to us will trigger that trauma again for them, for example. So maybe I say waterfall. To you, that might seem innocent. To me, it reminds me of a horrible breakup in Switzerland that happened at a waterfall. That's a triggering word. I'm laughing. It's not exactly triggering, and I don't mean to make light of triggers, but this is ultimately what it's demonstrating. When we adopt an encoding and a decoding perspective, it implies that there's some arbitrariness between how a message is received and how it is encoded or put out there or constructed. So it's a naive account of messages, of cultural objects. We could say, for example, that this is simply a painting and it's simply a goat with a family looking at it, right? But is that all it is? We'll have to see how it's encoded and how we decode it. So we presume that when we interpret other people's words, when we interpret things that are happening in the media, when we interpret pieces of art and so on, that somehow our interpretations are actually linked to some intrinsic quality in the object or message. And what Stuart Hall is trying to convince us of very early, we're talking like 1950s, 1960s, is that this is not true. There's something arbitrary about the way messages are interpreted and constructed. A painting of a pair of shoes, for example, it could be interpreted as simply a pair of shoes, or it could be interpreted as a critique of the way in which people on farms are overworked. I'm thinking of a particular painting by Van Gogh, but I'm not going to get into it. So there, art is not static. It's not unchanging. It's not obvious and transparent. It's messages. There is an interpretive process involved there. There's nothing natural or essential about the meanings that we attribute to a piece of art. This is his point. So you can already see in this approach where you have a sender, a message, and a receiver, encoding, message, and decoding. You can already see a difference with, say, the Toronto school, the school of Marshall McLuhan, where the message is actually quite incidental. Here, you're foregrounding the message. In Marshall McLuhan, you're bracketing out the message. But we're going to get more into that later when we do a more developed compare and contrast. So the problem is very simple. It's that the receiver might receive a different message than the one that was sent by the sender. Some French thinkers actually believe that this always happens. It's not that it might happen. It does happen. It's a fact that we never get the exact message that was intended. Okay, so Stuart Hall and the British school were very influenced by Marxism. So Hall said that we could also imagine, I'm getting to the end. There's so much more I should be saying, but I can see now how much time we've spent already. The sender or the encoding is a bit like the producers in Marxism. The message is a bit like the commodity or the product in Marxism, and the decoding is a bit like the consumption or the consumer in Marxism. So the receiver, like the proletariat, the working class, they're not passive in how they receive a message. They receive it in their own way, actively interpreting it according to their own a priori, which means from the very beginning, cultural presuppositions. Hence, there's nothing passive about communication. We don't simply receive messages. We're actively interpreting and fabricating the messages that we're receiving. So we do have agency here. This is how you can see why you can see that Hall and Williams are actually very similar, despite the fact that we're focusing more on language with Stuart Hall. They're very similar because both Hall and Williams are restoring a sense of agency, ability, culture to consumers, to workers, to everyday people, which is fundamental and it's key. So what I hope to do is develop this chart a little bit more, maybe next class, and try and show you more of what's going on between these different schools of thought, to show how they each foreground different aspects of culture and media, and how they ask slightly different questions, and how they have slightly different key concepts and different key thinkers, and so on. But to summarize the most important point as I see it in the British school, it's that it has something to do with the concern for interpreting messages, which is quite different than what we see in the Toronto school and the Slovenian school. We're concerned with interpretation as an active capacity on the part of consumers or receivers of cultural artifacts and practices. Raymond Williams, Matthew Arnold, Stuart Hall, and many others, they're all sharing within this Birmingham school sensibility. They're all sharing a concern with interpretation as an active process, a concern with culture as a system of meaning or practices to be decoded and deciphered, an awareness that culture takes on different meanings or practices in a situational sense, in a context. In other words, the importance of placing culture within a context. I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to try and develop this a little bit more and make it more clear as we move forward. Hoping you're all doing well. I can't believe we're beyond the halfway mark in the course. I think we're a little bit beyond it now. It's unbelievable how fast we're moving. Please email me if you have any questions or concerns. A couple, I think it was 2 weeks ago, it seemed as though my email was down. I don't know how long it was down, but I heard that some students were emailing me and I didn't get the emails. So I usually respond within the same day to an email. So if I haven't, try again, or please write on the Blackboard. I don't know what's going on with IT. But okay, be well. Bye-bye.